design is based on pine cone, which is from, well, I thought it was a Scots pine. It turns out that it's actually a black pine. There's big pines all the way around Drumglass Park, and they're a major feature of it. And whatever time of year there's something going on with them, they're either coming, they're either got birds nesting in them, or there's pine cones on the ground, or they're moving in the weather or whatever. But they're just, to me, they were always like a major feature of the park. It seemed like a nice, strong, positive shape that people could identify with, and also would tie in nicely possibly with sort of schools looking at biodiversity and the sort of ecoculture, I suppose, of the and ecology of the park. I went and looked at the site, I suppose, at the first stage of the commission, when it was just a case of putting forward proposals, and kind of literally picked them up off the ground and just liked the form of them and thought that would be an interesting way to go. They're also quite sculptural forms, and they're a little bit like topiary hedges, and I'm quite interested in that sort of thing, that whole sort of idea of sort of control over nature and formal design, garden design. It is quite a small park. It is quite a designed park, and I suppose it maybe would have a little bit more formality to it than maybe some bigger parks in the city. So it seemed, that sort of creating maybe a series of focal points around the park would be kind of a nice thing as well, and there might even be a sort of sense of adventure for kids to kind of go around and pick things up and look and find and see. The next stage would have been to create the pattern for the main pine cone shape. This was done by building a steel armature in the shape, I suppose, really of a giant Easter egg, would be the best sort of comparison, and then clad in tie wire and chicken wire. That was transported to the factory in Lisburn, and then we clad it with about 2 inch thick, about 40-50 mil thick of terracotta clay, a smooth modelling clay, which allows you to get very good surface definition and detail. And then it was a case of rather complicated business of working out the sequence of patterns of the actual pine cone within the pine cone itself. This involved a rather complex series of putting in pins and dropping lines of string from the vertical, from the top of the pine cone right down. The whole structure is around about 2.5 metres high, and stood on a metre high bench, so the whole thing was sort of hanging off scaffolding. And the tricky bit was getting it mapped out in what's called the Fibonacci sequence, which is the way the pine cone kernels, I suppose, grow. So essentially it's like a double helix that spirals upwards from the bottom, and quite difficult to kind of establish. But once that was done, then the actual pine cone kernels, the little kind of sections of the pine cone, could be mapped out quite simply. The next sequence after that was to build up the surface of the clay using just standard modelling techniques, I suppose, sculpting techniques. And I worked up from the bottom to the top, roughing in the clay at the start, and then building it up and then carving it back. And this took over the process, I would say, of 4 to 6 weeks. And then by this stage, through the whole process, the thing is drying very, very slowly, because it was through the winter. And then that's a good thing, because then it allows you to kind of model and refine the surface. So the whole thing is about refining and refining and refining the surface as much as possible. So the mould making phase again took a lot of laying out, where we put metal shims or partitions halfway down the form to effectively cut it in half. And then after that, the whole piece was coated in silicone rubber, liquid silicone rubber, building up about 4 to 6 layers, I think it was. So once the silicone rubber coat's on, there's a glass fibre, well, it's a glass resin gel coat is put on, which essentially lifts all the detail of the back and supports the silicone rubber. And then after that, then there's layers and layers and layers of glass fibre. Goes on to create a semi-rigid shell. So it's a little bit like an Easter egg again, where you have, like, I suppose, layers of chocolate built up.
Sorry.
Essentially is a high grade concrete with a stone aggregate in it, which makes it extremely strong, but also gives you the possibility of wet and dry sanding it up to a finish that's almost like sort of terrazzo or marble.
But it has all the wee stones in it, and then when you polish it,